Nisa? Hi, Tinker. When you wrap up, how about you go on down to help get ready? Don't think I haven't noticed you've stayed nearly an hour later than we agreed on. Gelban Mechatork poked his head out of the siege tank he was in the middle of repairing, looking over at one of his top engineers of the Tinker's Court, Nisa Brightgale. She returned the pointed look right to him. Nisa was a bit younger than him at 94, but an accomplished tinker, and he recognized some of his own stubborn streak in her. Setting her wrench aside, she sat back, hand on her hip. I could say the same of you. He was caught, and he knew it, chuckling sheepishly. It was the first night of celebrations for Hallow's End. There was a feast in Ironforge that night to kick things off. As High Tinker, he'd agreed to represent his people at the event, with some reluctance. I promised I'd make the festival, not the preparations. And I'll keep that promise, he added hurriedly. Nisa sighed good-naturedly, beginning to collect her things. I believe you. Just don't be too late, or the others will have my head. The for not watching you went unsaid. She picked up her bag and looked at him again. The big dinner starts at 7, okay? 7, Gelbert repeated dutifully. Nisa departed with one last firm point in his direction, eyebrows raised. Gelban watched Nisa go until she disappeared over the rise of the hill, then dropped back inside the hole. He knew that this poorly hidden lack of interest in public appearances was talked about in some circles, even if it wasn't much of a problem in gnomish society. His own people worried about him for other reasons. Since the destruction of their capital, he was hardly ever alone while working in strange or open places, if any of his top engineers could help it. Or any of his novice engineers, or any Tinker's Court members, or anyone who happened to be about. Unless he was holed up in his office or at home, there was, not always, but often, someone helping him, asking for help, or just puttering around nearby. Anywhere that could possibly be dangerous, or just especially lonely, tended to come with some watchful eyes. He swore they had to have some sort of chart or calendar on who'd be the one to have a reason to watch him for special nights like this. Gelban didn't think he deserved the protective attitude, but if anything that seemed to encourage his citizens' watchfulness. An official guard might fix the problem, but he just couldn't stomach the idea of hiring one. Nisa must have really wanted to go, actually, to have left like that. He wished he'd sent her off sooner. As for him, he'd make his promise, but not yet. He had work to do, and this year's events had made that work especially important. There was a goblin saying that war was good business, and Gelban didn't wholly disagree, save that he made his business protecting as many of his people as he could. This siege engine would have every failsafe, and be better than ever before. Gelban was situated in the internal workings of the main engine with his glasses balanced on the tip of his nose, adding redundancies to the cooling lines and lubrication valves for the pistons. Zealous pilots had a habit of trying to push all their machines farther than the spec said was possible, so Gelban had made a habit of making his machines capable of a bit more than he could write into the specs. The left side was the last side, and he'd be done for the night after battle. With any luck, he'd be able to keep his promise plus some, and be early. It was times like this with his whole mind and body focused cleanly on work, good work, that would benefit and protect others, and the guilt that never truly went away was the quietest. If he had his way, not a single soul or more along his people would meet an end in the war, but as it was, well, Gelban tightened a bolt on the input valve that would remain closed unless the extra line was needed, running eyes and hands over it to ensure it was solid. Suddenly, he was broken out of his little reverie by a racket. It had been so quiet at first that he hadn't heard it, but now, the ground all but shook with what seemed to be the footfalls of some large creature that was far off but rapidly approaching. A two-legged one, by Gelban's estimation. Now that was odd. Some kind of enemy? He seriously doubted any denizen of the Horde to get this far into dwarven territory unhindered, nor be so large. An Etten? Gelban figured it was worth a look as he began carefully extricating himself from the machinery of the tank's main turbo. The footfalls abruptly came to a stop seemingly not too far off. Before he could even come out to properly look, Gelban heard the call. Trifling fools. Not even building a stronghold in this strange local can save you. There was a pause, as whoever it was, and who most certainly he was not an Etten, apparently caught his breath. Then the yelling continued at an even greater volume. Gelban could not help but think this would have been easier on him if he hadn't stopped so far from the actual gates of Ironforge. Your arrogance will be your undoing, for this fortress will face. Ironforge's would-be assailant then paused for last breath. While he'd been yelling, Gelbin got a good look at him. It was a Minari, bright red and half-naked, wearing little more than a leather skirt and some decorative armor. When he'd gasped for a second, hands on his knees, he leaned back up to holler at maximum volume.
Raxus! Eredar, Lord of the Burning Legion!
Gelbin was familiar with the name, and the man. He'd been there the last 2 times particular Minari had been summoned. The only casualty the first time had been the summoner himself, but there'd been a team of 10 or so decent gladiators on hand at the time. The second time, he'd been one amongst the sea of demons they'd faced on the broken shore, and Gelbin had only seen a horde force strike him down early in the fight from afar. Neither time had he faced civilians, and never only one person. His thoughts had turned first to all of his people behind them in the city, preparing for the celebration. Then, they turned to the tank he was still standing in. It could not yet be driven, but many of the weapons were operational. He took a mental inventory of all of them, how close they were, and how easy to activate. He was glad Nisa had gone on, assuming a cheerful, pleasant tone. Gelbin spoke. No need to yell. No one can hear you around here. Not on a night like this. Who said that? Show yourself, cowardly insect. The Eredar Lord snarled, looking around furiously. Gelbin waved cheerfully from where he was standing, completely unhidden, in the cockpit of the tank. Juraxus looked down at him, almost cartoonishly shocked. He looked haggard, and had early snow covering his legs nearly to the knee. Gelbin wondered if poor Sod had summoned him, and how far he'd walked to get here, and how he'd managed to walk here at all without being intercepted. He hoped the summoner hadn't been another gnome. Wilfred Fizzlebang had been a criminal and a thoroughly unpleasant man, but he'd been one of Gelbin's citizens, and as such, his responsibility nonetheless. As Gelbin had been thinking this, Juraxus had been looking at him, in turn, for the Fell Lord sensed something. Gelbin looked a lot like the Trifling Gnome who'd summoned him before, and yet, something was different. There was power in this tiny man. Juraxus could sense the aura of a man who'd soldiered on unending hardship, despite being forgotten. The aura of a man whose model hasn't been updated in 14 years. A man who, while all the other leaders' fancy models were at level 93 in Siege of Orgrimmar, was a 123 elite. Instinctively, Juraxus knew that no matter where he went and found this gnome, he'd still be a level 123 elite. Gelbin saw the look on his face and raised his eyebrows. The Fell Lord stammered, still yelling, Are you this place's only defense? Why not? Gelbin nodded cheerfully. I am. I see. Juraxus looked around. He looked at the tank. He looked at Gelbin. Would you like to come into the workshop? It's a cold night. If you would lead me willingly into your stronghold, I wouldn't fight such a foolish error. Gelbin hopped down from the tank and began walking briskly towards the workshop. And importantly, not towards the city. Juraxus gave a look to all the guns that Gelbin just cheerfully abandoned, as if they gave no advantage at all, and followed stiffly, clearly completely at a loss of what to do besides obey. Gelbin kept his pace normal as his field workshop came into view, and confidently strode in first. And as the door opened, Gelbin stepped to the side and onto one of the several buttons just behind it. Immediately as Juraxus came in behind him, one of the security systems he developed kicked into action. In mere seconds, the prototype Legion operative trapping device, or plot device, sent fell-guided restraints around his arms and legs, with legendary dwarfish precision. There was even a gag. Juraxus fell to the ground with a furious but muffled yell, and wiggled around to no avail. Gelbin put his hands on his hips. Worked perfectly, first time. Pays to be prepared, he thought with satisfaction. He kneeled beside Juraxus. He glared daggers at him from where his face was squished against the floor, doing the muffled tirade. Sorry about that, but I can't have a Legion invasion in my city. Wait here, Gelbin said, and hurried off towards Ironforge, ignoring the muffled threats from behind the door. He had to get help for this, and he knew just who to ask. Gelbin wound through the crowded square, dodging groups of gnomes, dwarves, and alliance races of all kinds without too much difficulty. He was stopped several times, but with a little small talk he slipped away. He found the queen near the announcing stand. She was kneeling beside her son, Dagrin, fixing a piece of his costume that had fallen loose. Gelbin wasn't entirely sure what the lad was supposed to be. Part of it looked like armor, but he also looked to be on fire with some paper flames. Finishing fixing it, Moira patted Dagger on the head, and he ran off with the other children. She stood and looked to Gelbin. He couldn't decide whether to be a paladin or the new Fire Lord, so he did both, made it himself, except for the armor. He's a creative one. That he is. Moira turned to him with a smile, then noticed his expression. She was immediately alert. Has something happened? In a manner of speaking. It's under control, I don't want any commotion, but I could use your advice. Moira nodded. Let's be discreet then. We'll talk more outside. Gelbin followed behind her as she strode calmly, but with purpose, out towards the gates. This time, there were fewer questions. She was a true statesman, Moira. Her very presence always seemed to communicate exactly what she intended it to. It was a shame how dwarvish prejudice had limited her. Once they were outside in the crisp autumn air, and, after nodding to the guards, had made their way out of earshot, she turned to him again. Alright, what's the nature of this emergency? Well, we've had a bit of an invader, Gelbin began. He was pretty easily caught, but, well, I think you'd better see this one for yourself. Moira squinted at the bound demon. Said demon wiggled around, yelling something unintelligible behind the gag. Kinda skinny for Eredar. Gelbin looked at Jiraxis again. He had a hard time thinking of any of the hulking Dre and I as small, but on closer inspection he was indeed kind of scrawny compared to some warriors of his kind Gelbin had seen. I think he was a summoner. Mainly, unless he was holding back for some reason the previous 2 times we encountered him. And you don't know when he was summoned, or by who, or where he came from? Gelbin shook his head, didn't really wait. I have a feeling he won't be quite in the mood to tell us at the moment. Jiraxis wiggled her angrily again, spitting what was probably curse words, whether just rude or a literal curse, through the gag. Moira regarded him for a moment, then turned and smiled exaggerately unpleasantly at Gelbin, winking once out of Jiraxis' line of vision. He nodded back, affecting an especially careless attitude. And it can't escape? Oh no, don't worry, this PLOT device is specifically designed for spell containment. Then I think, Hi Tinker, that you ought to leave him here and enjoy the feast. We can have some of his ex-compatriots tell us all about him later, I think. Gelbin smiled at the title. Well, that sounds like a plan, Queen Rhaegant. Wonderful. Moira drawled, almost comically maliciously. You shouldn't let something so small spoil the night. Of course. And they shut the door on the now furiously wiggling Fell Lord without farther discussion. At the feast, Gelbin couldn't quite forget their captain demon, but Moira was the same as ever, a master at acting as if nothing at all was amiss. He tried his best to emulate her. They'd had a more serious talk outside, and determined that there really was no risk in leaving him a bit longer, so he knew he shouldn't worry. But it felt strange, to say the least. He was sure some of his friends could tell he was nervous. After the feast concluded, Moira found the remainder of the council to let them know, and Gelbin set about contacting Velen to see if they could arrange for someone who knew Jiraxis to come and advise them. He supposed it was lucky that it had been in him who'd found Jiraxis first. All the leaders of the allied races of the Alliance had some sort of form of contact. He could contact Velen without delay on his magic missive singulator, or MMS. He felt a bit bad, though. It was generally understood that the Prophet and his people were on a sort of vacation, after finally being freed of the thousands of years of being under the Legion's shadow. But it had to be done. The 3 hammers were already scrabbling a bit on whether to keep or kill him, and Moira had to firmly remind them that Jiraxis was Gelbin's prisoner, not theirs. They'd all gone together to the office, only to find the Fell Lord sound asleep on the floor, snoring noisily. After Felstead woke him up with an all-too-gleeful kick, a small group of dwarvish and gnomish mages and guards, who had been gathered to escort him, confiscated his armor and transferred him to the Ironforge prisons used for high-profile and political prisoners. Since this was bound to alert the city, Gelbin and Mirrodin had been tasked with announcing everything. As such, there was a sizable amount of onlookers by the time the furious Fell Lord was taken through the city. But the extreme restraint seemed to satisfy, and besides assorted congratulations, especially from gnomes, and one scolding from an understandably worried Nisa, the transfer went on without a hitch. Once he was in, his bindings were removed with a bit of magic, and he immediately began shouting again "You fools, you've only brought me into your stronghold, and you will feel my wrath," and such. were stoutly ignored, as everything was secured and prepared. Now, we'll treat you humanely, you wretch, despite the trick of leaving you in the office for the feast, Moira told him, after rapping on the bars to get him to shut up. We'll have dinner and tea. We aren't monsters like your lot. In protest of Drax's outfit, which was truly minuscule when his armor had been taken from him, Muradin had also had someone go and find the largest shirt they could, a flannel made for a very fat dwarf. The result was that it was wide enough, but still far too short for him. The pants they offered were rejected with disdain. The sight of the Eredar lord in a plaid shirt that barely covered his ribs, and a leather miniskirt miserably eating a bowl of soup, was almost enough to make Gelbin laugh. And Falstad didn't even try not to, rolling with mirth as soon as he saw him. What a night.